Hello, in this video we're going to look at a few essential edits for landscapes using Lightroom, and if you want to do this with Photoshop's Camera Raw plugin you'll find near identical controls there too. Now we're going to start off with this image here on the right, and we're going to apply a few tonal edits to come up with a much better result like this image here on the left. And along the way we'll learn a few essential skills that you can apply to most, if not all, landscape images that you edit. So let's get cracking here. I'm going to highlight my starting image here, then go to the develop module. Now the first obvious problem we have here is this wonky horizon. You can see where the sea meets the land here that our horizon isn't straight. Now this could potentially be a really easy fix if we go down to the transform panel here and then click on level. Then often that will fix the problem, but you can see with this particular image it's actually made it worse. If we toggle it off and on again, you can see we've actually increased that wonk. So instead I'll leave it off, and I could go and use the rotate options here to rotate my image, or I could go and grab the crop tool and then I could use the crop box here to crop in, and this is quite helpful because we get these grid lines here, so I can see exactly how the horizon's going to look. So I can just level it out like this, and now I know that that's straight. I can also use this tool here, the straighten tool, and then just drag along the horizon line with the straighten tool to level out my crop. And I'll actually crop in a little bit tighter as well. I want to crop out this kind of section here to come in a bit tighter on this part of the image, and I want to make sure that my aspect ratio is set to my original ratio of 2:3. So I'm just going to lock that in by using that setting there, and then just drag my crop box to fit. I can also use these lines here which helpfully divide my image into thirds, and I can position that third line there along the horizon. That's usually quite a nice compositional trick to divide your image into three like this. So I'll double click to accept that crop. Next I'm going to go to the lens correction panel, which we'll find on the right over here. In fact, if we don't want to have to drag down through all of these panels here, we can right click over the panels and enable solo mode, and that means that all of the panels will be collapsed, and as we open one panel all of the others will collapse, so it just keeps our panels nice and tidy. So before I change anything here, I'm just going to zoom in really close here. So I'm going to choose a 4:1 ratio here, and let's just drag up to the edge here, and we'll see if we can spot some fringing. So here you can see we get kind of a purple edge along here and a slight green tinge to this edge here. So this is chromatic aberration. It's fringing along edges where bright pixels meet dark pixels, and you'll often find this in landscapes because you have a bright sky meeting a dark land, and in this case we get this really hard edge where the bright sky meets the dark rock. Now if we check remove chromatic aberration, you can see that that color fringing is automatically fixed. Now while we're here we may as well enable the profile corrections too. I'm going to zoom out before I do this and go to fit my image, and then as I check enable profile corrections we should see the lens automatically detected, but if it's not we can go into the lens profile drop down here and detect the lens manually. Now these are two really useful settings here that lots of photographers will want to apply by default to every landscape that they import into Lightroom. And if you want to do this, then you just need to hold Alt, and you can see this option down at the bottom here changes to set default. Now I'm not going to click it because if I do I'll set these two settings here as a default, but I'll also set that crop that we made as a default for all images too, which is obviously not what I want to do. So if you want to set that as a default, then you just need to reset any other previous settings that you've input, and then you can set those remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections options there as a default. Now another fix that we might want to apply to our landscapes is to correct for sensor marks or other little marks and blemishes in our image. So if we grab the spot removal tool from the toolbar over here, then we can do this. I'm going to zoom into a fill view here, and let's just tidy that panel away so we've got a better view of our image here. And then I can check for sensor marks in the image. Now, it can be quite tricky to spot sensor marks, but we can use this option down here, visualize spots, to give us a better view. And then we can use this slider here to control the threshold for the effect. So we just need to check around our image, and I think this image is okay, but we can just have a quick look around and I think we're all good. So if you do have any sensor marks, and it's worthwhile checking visualize spots and then looking over the image, particularly in the sky. And sensor marks are usually going to be more apparent in landscapes because we typically use a narrower aperture, say f/16 or above, when we're shooting landscapes. And at those narrow apertures, sensor marks are more noticeable. So it's worth checking for them in this way. Next, I'm going to apply a few tonal effects. So I'm going to bring my image back to fit it on the screen, and then I'm going to go to the basic panel here, and we'll start by setting a white and black point. And again, this is quite a useful edit for most, if not every, landscape you edit. So I'm going to hold Alt here and drag the whites slider, and this gives me a view that shows me clipped pixels as I drag. So you can see the further I drag, the more areas begin to appear in white. Now, that tells me that these areas are going to be clipped to pure white, and that means they're lacking in detail. So what I want to do is drag to a point just before those clipped pixels begin to appear, around about +6 on this image here. I'll do the same with the blacks here. I can hold Alt and drag the black slider, and I want to bring that to a point just before the clipped blacks begin to appear around about there. And I can go on and adjust the highlights and shadows if I like as well. So I'd like to bring back a bit more detail in the clouds here, so I'm going to try knocking back the highlights a touch, and you can see how that just gives me a bit more cloud detail there. And I'd also like to add a touch of clarity, which just crisps up the details and gives me more mid-tone contrast like that. And this is particularly useful for rocks and textures like this. And let's add a touch of vibrant as well, just to boost the color intensity. And I'm happy with that. Now I'd like to lift the rock here where it's in shadow, but I'm not going to use the shadow slider here. Instead, we're going to do this selectively using a local adjustment tool. So I'm going to grab the adjustment brush from the toolbar here for this, and I'm going to start by loading the tool with a tonal setting. Now, we can always tweak this afterwards, but we can perhaps just start by upping the exposure a little bit to there. And then we can use the left and right square bracket keys on our keyboard to resize our brush tip. And I'm also going to make sure Show Selected Mask Overlay is checked down here. We can hit O to toggle that off and on. And then I'm going to start painting over the rocks here. And I'll just quickly whiz over the area. I'm not being too precise about this. And then once we're done, what I'll do is uncheck the Show Selected Mask Overlay option here by hitting O, and then I can tweak the exposure setting here to lift that area. So I think I'll bring it to around about there, and we could also perhaps just up the shadows a touch as well. And you can see that gives me much greater detail in the rocks, but because of that messy painting, we're getting this kind of bright edge around the rocks. But I can use another setting to fix that and make my painting much more precise. If we go down to the range mask settings down here at the bottom of the adjustment brush options, then we can set this to luminance, and this allows me to restrict the local adjustment to a certain part of the tonal range. Now I can check this Show Luminance Mask option here, and this shows me exactly what's being affected. And then I can use this range setting here. Now I want to drag the white point here inwards, and this is restricting my effect to the shadow tones. If I toggle it off and show you how this is working, so that's without any range masking settings applied, and if I drag it inward, you can see how now we start to restrict the effect to the darker tones. If I don't want to use this Show Luminance Mask option here, I can also hold Alt and drag these sliders, and this gives me a view of what's being affected. So now I can see that the black areas are going to be restricted from the effect. I can also hold Alt and drag the Smoothness slider here, And if I bring it down a little bit, you can see I'm getting a much more precise edge to my local adjustment. Now I'd quite like to add another adjustment to lighten the rock here. So I'll go up to the top here and click on New, and then I'll start painting over that rock again. I can hit O to toggle my mask overlay off and on. So I'll just paint very roughly over the area. And again, I'll use the range masks settings here. I'll set this to luminance once more, hold Alt and drag the white point inwards like this, and then adjust the smoothness. So now I know I'm affecting that area of the image. In fact, let's just zoom in a little closer to that area so we can see what's happening here. And again, I can hit O to toggle the mask overlay off and adjust the tonal settings here to fine tune the area. So I could perhaps add a touch of clarity and a touch of exposure to that area to lift it. And I'm happy with that, so I'll hit done. And let's bring my image back to full screen once more. And I can see we're getting a little bit of lightening around the edge of the rocks here that I don't want. So I'll grab the adjustment brush again, this time load it with some negative exposure and just paint over that area to darken it down a touch like that. And then I can just tweak the exposure until it looks right. And I think I'll add one final local adjustment. So I'll click New again, this time using positive exposure. I'm just going to lighten this area of the sea here, just to draw the eye in towards the rock like this. Again, that's probably a bit too strong. I'm going to lower the exposure to around about 0.37 there, just to lift that area, and then hit done. So now I'm happy with those local adjustments. I'm going to finish off by adding a touch of sharpening. And again, this is something you're going to want to do to most, if not every, landscape image you edit. So I'm going to open up my settings here and go to the 1:1 view here. It's best to view sharpening at a 1:1 view. And then I'm going to go across to the right over here and we'll head to the detail panel. Now we can choose the overall sharpening strength here with the amount slider. And then we can use the radius slider to control the size of the sharpening effect. So this effectively pushes the sharpening further away from an edge as I drag it across. If I hold Alt and drag the radius slider, you can see exactly what's happening. So you can see with a high radius, we push the sharpening further away from the edges, and edges anywhere where a light pixel meets a dark pixel. If we drag it downwards, then we can restrict the sharpening effect to the area around the edges. So I'm going to bring that to around about 0.8. It's usually best to use a low radius with landscape images and then just tweak the sharpening amount to suit. Now another useful setting here is masking. I'm going to go back to my full view for this. If I hold Alt and drag the masking slider, then we get a view that shows us black on white, and this tells us what's being masked from the sharpening effect. So you can see as I hold Alt and drag across, we're masking those black areas from the effects of the sharpening. And this can be useful if we don't want to sharpen detailless areas of the image, like the soft details in the sea here and in the cloud. And there we have it. That's my finished image. So let's take a quick look at a before and after view here, and this will show you exactly what's happened here with our image. So you can see this was our original image here on the left, and with a few simple adjustments here, we come up with something that's much more pleasing. So there we have it. That's a few essential edits for your landscape photos.